Of all the chapters in the long and varied history of our craft, not one is more interesting or more important to know than that which relates to how they grew up alongside the first Grand Lodge, a rival Grand Lodge, how the two became bitter rivals, and how at last a union was brought about. Therefrom, a reader can learn how certain changes came into the craft which still puzzle him, and also, to a certain extent, why Masonic ceremonies in America differ from those practiced in England.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's presentation, From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore.
Section 1. Causes that led to the rift. It is absolutely impossible to work out a connected and detailed history of all the causes that led, at last, to the formation of a new Grand Lodge, and, for the same reason, impossible to lay one's finger on a certain year or place and say, here is where it all began. The thing came about gradually and out of many forces at work. One of the main results of the formation of the first Grand Lodge, established at London in 1717, was that operative masonry was completely laid aside in favour of speculative masonry. Such a radical change in the inmost nature of the craft could not but arouse opposition. It is supposed, for example, that the difficulties into which Anthony Sayer fell after he had served as the first Grand Master may have been due to his dislike of the new regime, he having been an old operative mason. How much trouble the great change caused, or how long it lasted, is now impossible to determine. But it seems evident that a resentment against the new order of things lasted long in some quarters, and that whole lodges refused for many years to acquiesce in so complete a departure from the old ways. Another cause of trouble in the early years of the first Grand Lodge was the adoption of the paragraph concerning God and religion in Anderson's constitutions. Prior to 1717, the rank and file of craftsmen had been of the Christian persuasion, and the craft itself, to judge by its own constitutions, had been frankly Trinitarian Christian. The new constitutions, now associated with the name of Anderson, changed all this. According to its somewhat ambiguous wording, a Mason was required only to be of that religion in which all good men agree. This did not please those who wished to see Freemasonry remain specifically Christian. Consequently, they made trouble about it. From the records of the first Grand Lodge itself, it is evident that all was not smooth sailing. There was constant complaint of irregular makings, but little was done to head off that evil. Also, it appears that the Grand Lodge affairs were managed with laxness, if not sometimes with downright carelessness. A fair example of this is furnished in the case of Lord Byron, who was elected Grand Master April 30th, 1747. That gentleman, sometimes known as the Wicked Lord Byron, appeared before his brethren only 5 times in 5 years, and seems to have paid little heed to his responsibilities. The carelessness aroused so much feeling that it was the opinion of many old Masons to have a consultation about electing a new and more active Grand Master. They assembled for that purpose, and would have carried it through had it not been for the intervention of Brother Thomas Manningham, M.D. From this, and from similar instances that could be named, one may judge that Grand Lodge did not keep a very tight hold of the reins, a fact that will help to explain what came afterwards. Innovations had been made. A worse thing, worse that is from the point of view of the conservative brethren at the time, was that the first Grand Lodge deliberately made a few drastic innovations in the old forms, a thing that came about after this wise, so it is believed. After Freemasonry became more or less popular in London, numberless men became desirous of making their way into lodges without the troublesome cost of a regular initiation. To meet their needs, certain so-called exposés were published, the most notable of which was Masonry Dissected by one Samuel Pritchard, described as a late member of a constituted lodge. Upon this, clandestinism became so rife that at last Grand Lodge, in self-defence, determined upon making changes in the esoteric work that would enable regular lodges to detect the frauds. It is, unfortunately, now next to impossible to learn with certainty just what these changes were. But, according to the enemies of the Grand Lodge of 1717, and to scattered references in Grand Lodge records, they were somewhat as follows. The installation ceremony of the worshipful master was either abolished or suffered to go by default. The third degree was remodelled. The symbolism of the preparation of a candidate was changed. One of the most important secrets of the first degree was transferred to the second, and vice versa. Some of the old geometrical secrets, long practised among ancient operative Masons, were either entirely omitted or else changed out of all recognition, etc. As a proof that such charges of innovations were not without foundation, in fact, is an entry in the Constitutions of the Grand Lodge of 1717, 1784 edition, which says,
"Some variations were made in the established forms, the more effectually to debar the clandestines and their abettors from the lodges."
Still another cause that contributed to the new developments has to do with the Royal Arch, a subject peculiarly difficult to deal with, especially on paper, and then in a short space. Lawrence Dermott, the creative genius of the new Grand Lodge, about whom more anon, once wrote these words:
"A modern Mason, a member of a lodge under the Grand Lodge of 1717, may safely communicate all his secrets to an ancient Mason. The member of a lodge under the constitutions of the Grand Lodge started in 1751, but that an ancient Mason cannot with safety communicate all his secrets to a modern Mason without further ceremony."
After citing these words, and some others not necessary to be included here, Brother Fred J.W. Crowe, in his revision of Gould's concise history, remarks that
"There is little doubt that these differences consist of changes in the third degree and the introduction of the Royal Arch."
the Royal Arch became an issue. The theory here is that in their reorganization of the ritual, de Saglia's and his fellows in the early days of the Grand Lodge of 1717 left the third degree without its logical conclusion, so that a certain vital secret was lost, but not found, and that many of the brethren, in order to complete the symbolism, either adapted or created a supplementary ceremony to make good the loss. In so doing, they ran counter to the practices of the Grand Lodge of 1717, and thereby became stigmatized as irregulars. Firm in their belief that they were right and the Grand Lodge was wrong, they persisted in their course until at last they founded a Grand Lodge of their own. This, as stated above, is a theory, but there are facts to support it, and it is reasonable on the face of things. Be the facts what they may, it is certain that after the new Grand Lodge was formed, it made use of the ceremony known as the Royal Arch, and practised it as part of legitimate ancient Freemasonry. The results of this have been succinctly described by W. J. Hewen.
The Royal Arch degree was not started by these antients, but only adapted by them as an authorized ceremony. In self-defense, the moderns, who had worked it before the origin of the Athol Masons, but not officially, gradually gave it more prominence. In 1767 they formed a grand chapter of Royal Arch Masons and issued warrants for chapters, pushing the degree more even than the antients, though not recognized by their Grand Lodge. So, at the union of the two Grand Lodges in December 1813, the way was prepared for the inauguration of the United Grand Chapter in 1817, the ceremony being adopted as the completion of the Master Mason's ceremony, not as a separate and independent degree.
The most important result of further study has been to abolish the old notion that the ancient Grand Lodge resulted from a schism or secession from the older Grand Lodge. The schismatic theory was given currency by the older Grand Lodge, and it came to be generally accepted among its supporters and apologists. Even Gould, who was usually so independent in his theorizing, clung stubbornly to it long after others had been convinced of this view. Research makes it clear that the ancient Grand Lodge grew up not out of a split-off from the Grand Lodge of 1717, but from independent causes, and that, in a day before the doctrine of exclusive jurisdiction had been adopted, there was no illegality in such a step. The next most important result of research was that the primary inspiration in the founding of the ancient Grand Lodge came from Irish Masons, who had settled in London, and who had not been recognised by the Grand Lodge of 1717. Sadler shows that the majority of the members of the first lodge, warranted by the ancients, were Irishmen, and that they closely copied the usages and customs of the Grand Lodge of Ireland, and that in the loose talk of the times they were accordingly dubbed Irish Masons. Most of these men were of the so-called lower classes, painters, tailors, mechanics, labourers, and so on, thereby standing in sharp contrast to the membership of the lodges working under the Grand Lodge of 1717. The ancients were close to the Grand Lodge of Ireland. The ancients differed much in their practices from the older Grand Lodge, and at the same time, in so differing, stood close to the customs of the Grand Lodge of Ireland. A summary of this may be given.
It will doubtless suffice if I merely mention the chief remaining points of connection, and similarly without further comment. The Book of Constitutions and the bylaws for private lodges, craft warrants recognizing the Royal Arch degree, Grand Lodge seals, and the method of affixing them with the same coloured ribbons, which so far as I know were not used by any other Grand Lodge, certificates in Latin and English, constitution of a lodge for grand officers only, and the names of the members entered in the front of the register. System of registration in the books of the Grand Lodge, the fact that the ancients were designated Irish Masons, their lodges Irish lodges, and their warrants Irish warrants, by independent and unofficial writers at various periods, from about 15 years after their organisation in 1751 up to the end of the last century.
After the new Grand Lodge was once underway, and after it had begun to come into conflict with the older body, of course the defenders of the ancients began to make up arguments to defend their own position. To a large extent, such arguments were merely special pleading, and not now to be taken with much seriousness. Section 2. The formation of the ancient Grand Lodge. It is time to give an account of how the ancient Grand Lodge came into existence. First, however, I shall say a word about Lawrence Dermot, who figured so much in all that happened. Dermot was born in Ireland in 1720, 22 years before the birth of William Preston, who saw the first light of day in Edinburgh in 1742, and who alone of all the luminaries in Freemasonry of that generation shares with Dermot an equal fame. Dermot was initiated in Ireland in 1740 and went through the chairs of Lodge No. 26, Ireland, where he was installed Worshipful Master on the 24th of June, 1746. It appears that he was fairly well educated for those days, and Gould is of the opinion that he probably knew a little Hebrew, which will account for the fondness he had of covering his papers with Hebrew characters, that ancient and difficult language. He moved to London, probably as a youth, with little in his pocket but many schemes boiling in his head, which head was tireless alert, witty, sarcastic, and often a bit unscrupulous in waging war on his foes, of which his energy made him many. It seems that he engaged himself as a journeyman painter. Preston became a journeyman printer, it will be remembered, and that he prospered so that in years after he spent much money in charity and in his Masonic activities. In late records he was described as a wine merchant, and it appeared that he enjoyed the luxury of gout. Once made a Mason, he never rested, but devoted himself to it as to a mistress, with passionate earnestness, never permitting himself to become discouraged, and always in the front line of battle. Aside from his genius in putting a Grand Lodge under way, his greatest achievement was the composition of his A Hymen Raison, meaning worthy brother secretary, in the constitutions of the new Grand Lodge, and afterwards adopted by many other Grand Lodges. The Grand Committee is formed. So much for Dermot. The extent of the irregular makings, so often complained of in the records of the Grand Lodge of 1717, may be shown by the fact that because of these, the Grand Lodge erased from its list at least 45 lodges between 1742 and 1752. Brethren so dealt with, along with many freelancers and also some independent or St. John's lodges, came together and formed a Grand Committee of the most ancient and honourable fraternity of free and accepted Masons. This committee formed itself into the Grand Lodge of England according to the old constitutions, which Grand Lodge afterwards came to be called the Ancient Grand Lodge, in contradistinction to the modern, as the older Grand Lodge became dubbed. The earliest record of the Grand Committee is of date 17th of July 1751. On that day, Lodges number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 were authorised to grant dispensations and warrants and to act as a Grand Master. The office of Grand Master itself was left vacant until a noble brother could be found to accept the position, and the place of Lodge number 1 was left standing to be occupied by that Grand Master's lodge. A thing suggested, no doubt, by the Grand Lodge of Ireland having done the same thing. John Morgan was elected Grand Secretary in 1751, but it appears that he was lax in his duties. Therefore, Lawrence Dermot was elected to take his place in 1752, after which time the Grand Secretary's most bitter enemies could not complain of any laxness whatsoever, because Dermot became the leading spirit in all that followed, and it was to his genius that a group of malcontents, drawn from what at that time were the lower or middle classes, were able to forge ahead and grow more rapidly, time taken into consideration, than their rival Grand Lodge. One of the expedients hit on by Dermot was the warranting of military lodges, a thing not done before, and which accounts for the rapid growth of ancient Masonry in the American colonies. For, owing to the use of warrants to army lodges, the British forces in that continent became Masonic missionaries. The modern Grand Lodge afterwards followed suit in this. Another expedient was the frank and open pushing of the Royal Arch degree. It is easy to understand that a system offering 4 degrees would make more appeal to the generality than one offering only 3. Also, the ancients were able to secure formal endorsements from the Grand Lodges of Ireland and Scotland, and in addition thereto, a certain amount of active support from those influential bodies. It must be noted that of the 60 years during which the ancients had a Grand Master, a Duke of Athol occupied the throne for 31 of them. It was for this reason that the ancients were often called Athol Masons, and for a corresponding reason that the moderns were sometimes called Prince of Wales Masons. They grew rapidly. The zeal and energy of the ancient leaders, in addition to the superior attractiveness of their degree system, is shown in the rapidity with which the new Grand Lodge made headway. In 1753, a dozen or so lodges were on the list. During the next 4 years, and largely owing to Dermot's activity, 24 were added. Between 1760 and 1766, while the Earl of Kelly was nominally Grand Master, 64 more were taken in charge. By 1813, when the Union was effected, the ancients claimed a grand total of 359 lodges, though it is certain that in many cases the names of defunct lodges were still carried. The ancients adopted as their book of constitutions the Hayman Raison, largely the work of Dermot, though he closely followed, in the main, the lines of the constitutions of the Grand Lodge of Ireland, and at the same time borrowed with a free hand the Anderson's constitutions used by the moderns, first published in 1723. The first edition of the Hayman Raison appeared in 1756. By closely following the constitutions already in use, Dermot was able to avoid the appearance of too wide a departure from Freemasonry as already practised, and at the same time, though unwittingly, prepared the way for the union that came afterwards, a fact of happy augury for the craft at large. The existence of 2 Grand Lodges, both with their headquarters in London, naturally caused a great deal of confusion and misunderstanding among ordinary Masons. In many cases, such brethren held no brief for either party, so that in some cases it is of record that a man held office in lodges under both constitutions. But for the most part, there was a good deal of bitterness among the partisans, although it must be said that the ancients were more avid of controversy than the moderns, and that in almost every instance when an olive branch was extended, it was from the latter named camp. In 1797, a move was made looking towards union, but the project fell through. 2 years afterwards, however, the 2 Grand Masters, the Earl of Moira for the moderns and the Duke of Atholl for the ancients, acted together to have the craft specifically exempted from the Act to prevent secret societies in England. Also, as another step that paved the way for a merger, the modern Grand Lodge succeeded in securing the endorsements of the Grand Lodges of Ireland and Scotland, in such wise as to place the ancients on a somewhat doubtful footing, a thing that completely reversed the original situation so far as those 2 grand bodies were concerned. The union is effected. As early as 1809, committees met to consider the propriety and practicability of union. On October the 26th of that year, the Earl of Moira, for the moderns, warranted a special lodge to serve as a means for bringing about a merger. This lodge held its first meeting on the 21st of November, and then resolved to call itself the Special Lodge of Promulgation. On April the 10th of the year following, the Earl of Moira informed his Grand Lodge that both he and the Grand Master of the Ancients
were both fully of opinion that it would be an event truly desirable to consolidate under one head the 2 societies of Masons that existed in this country.
These proceedings were transmitted to the Grand Lodge of Ancients, where this frank avowal of a desire for union was met with unfeigned cordiality, so that, after concessions were made by both sides, although more heartily by the moderns, it was agreed all the way around that differences should be ironed out and that a union be made. The Grand Assembly of Freemasons for the union of the 2 Grand Lodges of England was therefore held on the 27th of December 1813. With due and solemn ceremonies, the long-wished-for merger was consummated, all grand officers showing, almost without exception, a fine and statesmanlike spirit. Each of the 2 Grand Lodges participating appointed a committee of 9 expert Master Masons, or past masters, and these were then formed into a Lodge of Promulgation, the purpose of which was to work out a form of ritual acceptable to all. This lodge continued its work from 1813 to 1816, often against opposition. The work of preparing a new code of regulations for the United Grand Lodge was referred to a Board of General Purposes. Its work was approved by a special Grand Lodge on the 23rd of August, 1815. Meanwhile, in order to bring about the closest relations possible between the new United Grand Lodge and the Grand Lodges of Scotland and Ireland, an international commission was formed. As a result, it was declared that
the three Grand Lodges were perfectly in unison in all the great and essential points of the mystery and craft, according to the immemorial traditions and uninterrupted usage of ancient Masons.
8 resolutions, called the International Compact, were adopted. Part 4, by way of conclusion. If one will take a sufficiently wide view of the history of English Freemasonry from 1717 until the Union had everywhere been accepted, he will see that the whole period takes on the character of a grand transition, and that, in this perspective, the mere details and machinery of the Great Cleavage, along with the subsequent official Act of Union, drop into second place as events, great in importance, but of the nature of incidentals. The change from operative to speculative Masonry, officially made in 1717, was profound beyond our usual understanding of it, and such a change could be completed only after many years, much experiment, and a long evolution. In this view, the great result of the Union was that it brought finally about the complete crystallization and solidification of speculative Freemasonry, fixed its character for generations to come, established in the United Kingdom the firm principle of exclusive territorial jurisdiction, and made possible the establishment inside the craft of those powers and authorities which today prevent the dispersal of its energies and the division of its forces. Even until now, that influence is at work, and it will continue at work until, out of its inevitable logic, a way will be found to unite and unify Freemasonry the world over, of which consummation we may all sincerely say, so mote it be. For a deep dive into the history, philosophy, and traditions of Freemasonry, subscribe to From the Quarries. You will find hundreds of lectures, presentations, shorts, and other Masonic works written by Freemasons, for Freemasons. Visit FromTheQuarries.com or YouTube @FromTheQuarries.